What is up, my Squirtleites? It is I, your king, welcoming you to episode 2 of The Decree. Now, before we get into the topic of today's video, I want to actually touch upon the subject I was originally going to address in this video, only because it still might happen in the future. Now, I was going to originally talk about film adaptations of video games. This obviously, is in relation to the two current topics at hand, which are the Sonic the Hedgehog movie and the Detective Pikachu movie. Now, I was originally going to talk about it because of the Sonic the Hedgehog trailer that came out, and I think we can all agree that it was pretty darn awful. I mean, there were elements of it that were fine. I mean, Jim Carrey, it's very classic Jim Carrey that we saw in that trailer, which I think in and of itself, sparked some nostalgia for some people and had some good elements to it. But for the most part, the trailer was pretty darn awful. And Sonic, the character himself, it was an abomination. I don't really think there's any other way to put it. However, the feedback was so harsh for the way that Sonic looked that they're actually going back and changing the way that he looks in the film. Do I think that's going to make it a better film? No, but that topic is for another day. Because of the fact that they're changing the character, I now don't really necessarily have a reference point to go back to that won't make the video dated. So instead, I'm going to wait until after I see the Detective Pikachu movie, and then I can use that as either a good or bad example for the point that I'm trying to make in the video. So save that for another one. That might even be the next episode. Depends on how quickly I can see Detective Pikachu. We'll see. For now, though, we're going to touch upon something completely different. And this is another not as current topic, but is still something that I have been thinking about a lot over the past few months, and has definitely been brought on by a lot of self-reflection on myself and how I need to change the way that I criticize things when it comes to video games. Because in this episode, I do decree that reviews are a bit of a fickle thing. Now, when I'm talking about reviews, I don't just mean the reviews you see on Metacritic, the scores from your likes of IGN, GameSpot, Polygon, Game Informer, Destructoid, etc. I'm not just talking about review outlets. I'm talking about reviews in general, just feedback in general from anybody, whether it's, the layman posting on Facebook or Twitter in a couple paragraphs or even, a few sentences saying what they thought about a game, all the way down to the 3-word comment in a YouTube comment section that just says this game sucks. I mean, that's still technically a review. That's still technically what their thoughts on the game are. That's still technically feedback. Now, is it necessarily honest feedback? Is it intelligent feedback? No, but that's kind of what the purpose of this video is about. It's not to talk about the usefulness and the nature of reviews themselves. I feel like that's been covered by plenty of people. I think what's more important is talking about how we translate the usefulness of reviews into better and broader discussion, how we communicate with one another, because I think that's really the most important thing. Because, well, for two reasons. One, it's better for the games that we play, and better for, it's healthier for games as a whole. And I'm not saying that we as consumers necessarily owe that to the games, but I also do think it does a service to us, the players, as well. And, there's a few topics that I'm in, a few different sub-levels to this topic that I want to touch upon throughout this video. So bear with me for a minute, but let's start with the review outlets, okay? Those mainstream media outlets, quote unquote. I hate to call them journalists, honestly, because, game journalism is, it exists. It's just very rare, far and few between. That said, most people tend to look at review outlets in one of two ways. Either they live and die by the score that appears on their screen, whether or not it has no substance to it. They just click to the end of the IGN video and an 8 flashes up and they go, oh, that's what I was hoping. I'm going to play it now. Or they go, oh, an 8? That's terrible. Never playing this game for some reason, assuming that 8's a bad score. I don't know. Some people think it is. The other response, instead of living and dying by the scores, are people never, ever trust reviewers. They always contest any pros or cons that they might have for a game. They always contest the scores, and they just buy a game anyway, or they just don't buy a game anyway, and they just try to pretend that those mainstream media outlets don't exist. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm definitely closer to that end of the spectrum, but I do like to think I'm somewhere more in the middle. I still think reviews are very useful, but I only use them for very specific and certain purposes, and I think that they should be used for these very specific and certain purposes. There's a few reasons for this. And I know it's difficult and it's definitely on a game-to-game basis, but one of the reasons that reviews are useful is because they can actually tell you, for one, that the game that you want actually functions. That's incredibly important. And, you know, obviously companies try to skirt around that by messing with embargoes and things like that, or giving, you know, doctored copies to reviewers, or, you know, messing with patches and things like that. You never really know if it's going to be in a perfect state, but usually if a reviewer tells you the game runs very poorly, that's at least something that you got out of that review, regardless of the quality of the actual game otherwise. But another thing, and the reason I tend to use reviews the most, is I like to use them to compile bullet points. Now, obviously, I don't expect everybody to do this. I mean, this is definitely requires a lot more effort and is something that you don't always need to do, and even I don't always do, especially if with games I'm not actually interested to begin with. But something I like to do is take multiple reviews from multiple outlets, compile the pros and the cons from each reviewer, and if I see a correlation between them, so like let's say they all say the same good thing about a game, I add that to the list of pros. If only one of them says a good thing, but the rest of them don't mention it, that's something that I would usually consider that reviewer's opinion and not a broadly shared thing across, you know, all review outlets. That's not going to be something that people think in general. And then I do the same thing with the cons. I tend to take all of the bad things that are said commonly throughout the reviews and add that to my list of cons. And then what I do is after I get all the bullet points that I've gotten from each review, mind you, this requires reading the reviews and not just skipping to the end for the score. I know for some people that's very difficult, but you need to do this if you actually want to read a review at all. Don't just look at the score, please. But anyways, I then go through all the pros and I see which ones actually matter to me. Are they stuff that I have originally cared a lot about in previous games? If they are, I know I'm probably going to like the game. If they don't really matter to me all that much and they're stuff that I'm not interested in all that much, then I'm probably just going to put it to the wayside and move on to the cons. Then I do the same thing. I evaluate whether or not those cons matter or don't matter to me or haven't in the past. And sometimes I will take note of the fact if like a reviewer or multiple reviewers mention that not only are they cons, but they're like extreme cons, then I, look at them a little bit differently, but I try to make note of those kinds of things. That's how I use reviews, and I usually only do that for the games I really care a lot about to begin with. Games that really held my interest. And, I would say about 95% of the time, I end up getting the game anyway, if I already knew I was going to like it. 5% of the time, I've probably been dissuaded, but at least I feel like I didn't waste my money. And for the most part, when, those few percent that I have, I could probably count the number of times that's happened on two hands. But when that's happened, I've never really regretted the purchase because then after the fact, I've heard nothing but bad things about those games. So the reviews serve their purpose. They actually save me from bad purchases. I mean, it's not to say I agreed necessarily with any of the reviewers that I read, but they still gave me the information I needed to make my purchase, which that is how reviews are supposed to be used. But that is, in my opinion, not the sole purpose of reviews. In fact, the biggest purpose for reviews, and this does not just apply to video game reviews, and it does not just apply to journalists, this applies to every review you ever hear, is that the most important thing that a review can do is spark discussion and enhance the way we communicate. And this, again, is what I want to really touch upon in this video, is the way we communicate. Most people, if you haven't noticed, and even especially lately, now that the internet is becoming newer and broader and more people are communicating and more people are finding shortcuts for that communication and finding more efficient ways to say less words as much as possible nowadays, or replace them with as many emojis as you possibly can. People don't really talk anymore. Have you ever noticed that about social media? It's a very common thing nowadays. And because people don't like to talk anymore or say as many words as they need to say or try to articulate anything, they tend to say a lot of bullcrap. They tend to say a lot of stuff that doesn't really mean anything. And that also comes down to the way that people talk about video games. This game is a masterpiece or this game is trash. There is almost never anywhere in between when it comes to the way most people talk about video games. And that is, I think, the core issue with the way we talk about games nowadays. That is the core issue to this whole discussion. And me, before I sound any more like a hypocrite, because anybody who has ever followed me on social media is probably immediately thinking, wait a minute, Levi, you've been like that many times in the past. And you know what? I have. I absolutely have. It's because I too have succumbed to the culture of Twitter. I have succumbed to the culture of the YouTube comment section, the way to efficiently just spout as few words as you possibly can to get your point across. And I'm not saying, first of all, I'm not saying that being blunt on its own is a bad thing. And I'm not saying that there isn't a time and a place to say a game is a masterpiece or this game is trash. But honestly, those moments are very few and far between. A lot more than they're actually used. Those kinds of moments are more for when you're joking around, when you're hanging out with friends, when you're memeing and things like that. When you're actually trying to tell somebody and give somebody information, which is actually a more common context, just saying a game is a masterpiece or saying a game is trash, either of those responses, people don't respond to them very well. I mean, if you just say a game is trash, most of the time, if you haven't noticed, especially if you've been on the receiving end of that, most of the time, people just roll their eyes and move on to the next opinion. They look elsewhere. Even if you say a game is a masterpiece and don't say anything more about it, they tend to do the exact same thing. And why wouldn't they? Because that doesn't really tell them the information that they need to know. You can just go and tell somebody, Citizen Kane is the greatest film of all time. Okay, but why? Why would I want to go see a movie that came out, dozens, decades and decades before I was even born, if you're not going to tell me why it's a masterpiece? It's the best movie ever? Okay, moving on. I'm going to go see something else then. That doesn't explain anything. That's not how you have a conversation. And again, like I said, I've been very guilty of this, especially with games that I dislike. I have absolutely been on the Ubisoft games suck, the Anthem sucks, Division's terrible, there's another Tom Clancy game. Okay, I'm bashing specifically on Ubisoft right now, but I've done that with mostly games like that. I have just been, this game's trash. And I need to stop doing that. I absolutely need to stop doing it. It's part of why I don't go on Twitter as much anymore, just because I don't like that culture. I don't like that culture of just trying to, again, say things as efficiently, but also as ugly as possible, and just spit it out there for the sake of lol memes. It's not really a healthy way of interacting. It's kind of trashy, actually. And it's also incredibly unintelligent. And again, I think we could do better by both games and ourselves by having more intelligent discussion, by actually providing a discourse and actually explaining what we like and what we don't like about games. And it's not that hard to do. You don't have to say it in a lot of words still to make those points come across. You can still say, even if you've never played the game before and you declare the game trash, you can still say, well, I've heard this, and this about the game. Common complaints that you've heard. Like, for instance, okay, let's talk about Anthem for a second. So I actually recently had somebody ask me, hey, is Anthem any good? I've not played it. I mean, I technically have, but I only played the alpha. I have never owned the game because of the horribleness that surrounded it, and I just knew I needed to stay as far away from it as possible. But I actually had someone recently ask me, hey, so how good is Anthem? What's going on with Anthem? In fact, they'd even heard a little bit about the controversy around it. And I explained to them, I wanted to say, oh, the game's bad, but then I stopped myself and I said, but the thing is the flying combat is really, really good. A lot of people love it. The problem is that the game has no end game to it. The campaign itself is kind of underwhelming, and the systems are very shallow, and once you reach the end, you're kind of out of things to do. It's not like the Division 2 right now, or Destiny 2, or Warframe, or all these other games where you can just go on forever and ever and, not run out of things for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of hours. Anthem, you're done in under 100 hours, which if, you're that kind of person who doesn't want to invest that kind of time, maybe it's still for you. But for the people who are looking for a robust experience, which this person was, I had to tell them, it's probably not for you. And again, I can say that in a very concise tweet. I can say, combat's good, campaign's shallow, endgame is lacking, support for it is minimal. There you go. You could fit that in half a tweet. I mean, that's not really hard to do. And I'm not saying you need to phrase things that way all the time, but still, it is helpful. If somebody comes to you and genuinely wants to know an opinion on something, even if you don't know what to say, you can just say, I don't have an actual opinion on it, and then they can move on. Or you can redirect them. You can point them to places that you've heard certain opinions at it. Heck, even if they're not going to click on the link, why not? You've heard an opinion on a YouTube video or something. Why not link the YouTube video? Like, hey, this YouTuber said this thing about the game. So, I mean, they really liked Red Dead Redemption 2. I haven't played it, but here, click their video and they'll tell you why it's good. And if you might agree with them. They don't even have to click on the video, but if they want that opinion, they'll click on it. I mean, what harm does that do? Really, what harm does that do? That only helps both the person that's asking and as well as, also the YouTuber, and it also helps the game itself. It helps the game get that little bit of exposure it needs because, let's face it, most people who play video games out there aren't like us. They're not the kind of people who are, or I guess I should say like me. They're not the people who are kind of, constantly immersed in the video game world, learning about every single thing that comes out, whether if it's got even, just an iota of hype behind it. That's just not how people function and operate. I mean, some of my proudest moments have been getting to play people to play indie games that never would have otherwise. The crowd that literally only ever buys the annual Call of Duty and an annual sports title, and they were like, well, I played Crash Bandicoot when I was a kid, and I've kind of always wanted to play like another good platformer. And then I said, well, there's this beautiful game on the Xbox One called Ori and the Blind Forest. And I got them to play it. And you know what? That's a proud moment. That's another thing, too. Take pride in it. Even if you aren't the type that, likes to review games or likes to give critique on things, take pride in the fact that you're introducing things to other people. I mean, that's kind of been the mission statement of my channel, as I've said before, that's what I like to do. But again, help yourself, help the people that are, coming to you with a question, and help the game by giving more than a 3-word answer. That's essentially the core of this video. That's really what I'm trying to get across. And it doesn't just pertain to video games, it pertains to movies as well. But that's the thing, though, is I feel like the discussion around film and television is much healthier than it is around video games. Video games is so snappy, and, they just say it's not worth your time, which is so weird to me because there's so many more moving parts to a video game than there is to film and television, and they're also so much more robust and long. I mean, video games are just bigger experiences. They're not necessarily more impressive experiences, but they're bigger. There's so much more to say about any one of them than you can say about most films, than you can say about most television shows, just in their very nature because of how much is compiled in there. And I don't know why, for some reason, video games have this culture of brevity surrounded them, and a very unintelligent brevity. And that's what I kind of want to change. Obviously, I can't change that by myself, but that's just something I want to talk about and something I want to see people do a little bit better. Because, again, games deserve it, consumers deserve it, and I just think it's healthier for the medium as a whole. So, yeah, that's really all there is to this video. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so very much for watching this episode of The Decree. I hope you all enjoyed it very much, and I will see you all in the next one.